The forbidding question the morning light of three suns cast strange shadows across the crystalline halls of Nexus Prime Military Academy. Students from dozens of worlds hurried through the corridors, their varied forms creating a living tapestry of galactic diversity. Among them walked Kira Velthan, her silver-blue skin gleaming as she navigated through the crowd with practiced ease, her forearms carrying different data tablets for her various classes. Kira had always been curious, even by Altarian standards. Her people were known throughout the galaxy for their analytical minds and thirst for knowledge. But Kira pushed boundaries that others wouldn't dare approach. Today, she was heading to her favorite class, Advanced Xenobiology and Warfare Studies. Taught by the legendary Professor Zenth Korgel, the classroom was a massive amphitheater carved from living crystal, its walls pulsing with soft bioluminescent patterns that helped students focus. As Kira took her usual seat near the front, she nodded to her study companions. Jorik Hammerstone, a member of the Hardy Stone clan people, was already reviewing his notes with typical methodical precision. His people might look like the mythical dwarves of human folklore, but they were among the finest military engineers in the galaxy. Beside him sat Lyra Songweaver, her translucent wings folded delicately against her back. The Celestials were known for their ability to sense the emotional resonance of conflicts, making them invaluable in understanding the psychological aspects of warfare. Her melodic voice often provided insights that others missed. Professor Korgel entered with his characteristic silence, his crystalline form refracting the room's light into dancing rainbows. The ancient Vorthic had seen more conflicts than any living being in the galaxy, and his presence commanded immediate respect. His deep, resonant voice filled the amphitheater as he began the day's lesson. Today, we examine the Galactic Defense Registry, he announced, activating the massive holographic display at the center of the room. Every species that has ever participated in sanctioned galactic conflicts is documented here. The display showed hundreds of species, each with detailed military records, tactical preferences, and historical contributions. Kira's analytical mind immediately began cataloging the information, but something nagged at her. She had studied xenobiology extensively, and there was a glaring omission. As Professor Korgel continued his lecture, highlighting various species' unique contributions to galactic security, Kira's unease grew. She cross-referenced her mental database of known spacefaring civilizations against the registry, and the discrepancy became undeniable. Professor, Kira interrupted, her voice cutting through the lecture. The amphitheater fell silent, and she felt hundreds of eyes focus on her. I noticed that humans aren't listed in the registry at all. They're a spacefaring species with advanced technology and significant population. Why are they completely absent from all military records? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Professor Korgel's crystalline features darkened, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, he said nothing. Other students began whispering among themselves, suddenly aware of the same omission Kira had noticed. Jorik leaned forward, his engineering mind immediately grasping the implications. She's right, Professor. Humans have colonies on 17 worlds, advanced spacecraft, and sophisticated weapons technology. By all metrics, they should be significant contributors to galactic defense. Lyra's wings shimmered with barely contained emotion as she added, I've met humans before. They seem intense. There's something about their emotional resonance that's different from other species. More focused, somehow. Professor Korgel stood motionless for long moments, his ancient mind clearly wrestling with something profound. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. Class dismissed, he said simply. But Kira wasn't about to let this go. As other students began filing out, confused and disappointed, she remained seated. Professor, with respect, that's not an answer. If humans exist and have the capability to contribute to galactic defense, why aren't they included? What happened? The last students left the amphitheater, but Kira's three friends remained with her, equally determined to understand. Professor Korgel looked at them for a long time, then sealed the chamber's entrances with a gesture. What I am about to tell you is classified at the highest levels of galactic security, he began, his voice heavy with reluctance. The information is restricted not to protect military secrets, but to protect the very stability of our galactic civilization. He manipulated the holographic display, and suddenly the room was filled with images of Earth, a blue and green world that looked deceptively peaceful from space. Humans, Professor Korgel continued, are not absent from military records by accident. They are forbidden from participating in any galactic military action. By unanimous vote of the Galactic Security Council, this prohibition, known as the Human Exclusion Protocol, was established exactly 200 years ago following an event we call the Terran Incident. Kira felt her heart racing as she absorbed this information. What kind of incident would result in an entire species being banned from military service? The kind that saves the galaxy, the professor replied grimly, and terrifies everyone. In the process, the holographic display shifted to show vast fleets of geometric spacecraft, their surfaces reflecting no light, moving through space like living shadows. 2 centuries ago, the galaxy faced its greatest threat, the Hive Collective. An ancient machine intelligence that had been dormant for millennia suddenly awakened and began consuming everything in its path. The images were horrifying, entire worlds stripped bare, the matter converted into more Hive units, fleets of living ships that adapted to every weapon used against them, becoming stronger with each encounter. The Hive's defining characteristic was adaptation, Professor Korrigal explained. Every weapon, every tactic, every strategy used against them was analyzed, understood, and countered within hours. Energy weapons became useless as they developed energy absorption. Kinetic weapons failed as they created adaptive armor. Even our most exotic technologies were neutralized almost immediately. Jorik's face had gone pale, his engineer's mind understanding the horrifying implications. A perfect adaptive defense would be nearly impossible to overcome with conventional tactics. Indeed, the professor confirmed. For 18 months, the combined fleets of 47 species threw everything they had at the Hive. We lost 70% of our total military capacity, and the Hive only grew stronger. They were approaching the core worlds when the Galactic Security Council made a desperate decision. The display now showed Earth's star system with small, primitive-looking human spacecraft gathering near the outer planets. Humans had only achieved interstellar travel 50 years earlier. Their technology was centuries behind our most advanced civilizations. Their ships were crude, their weapons basic, their tactics seemingly amateur. The council contacted them, as a last resort, asking for any assistance they could provide. Lyra's wings trembled as she sensed the emotional weight of what was coming. What did they do? Professor Korrigal's crystalline form seemed to dim. They volunteered their entire military capacity, every human ship, every soldier, every resource. They said they understood the stakes and were prepared to do whatever was necessary to stop the Hive. But how could such a primitive force succeed where advanced civilizations have failed? Kira asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer would be unsettling. That, Professor Korrigal said, is exactly what we underestimated about humans. We saw their primitive technology and assumed they would be ineffective. What we failed to understand was that humans don't think like the rest of us. When faced with an adaptive enemy that counters every conventional approach, humans do something that no other species in the galaxy would consider. The holographic display now showed human fleet formations, but something was wrong with them. The ships moved in chaotic patterns, seemingly without coordination or strategic purpose. They abandoned conventional military doctrine entirely, the professor continued, while every other species tried to fight the Hive with improved versions of tactics that had already failed. Humans approached the problem from a completely different perspective. They asked themselves a simple question: if the enemy adapts to everything we do, what happens if we do things that make no logical sense? The room was completely silent now, the only sound the soft humming of the holographic projectors. The human commander was Admiral Saracen, a woman whose psychological profile was so unusual that most species would have considered her mentally unstable. She gathered the human fleet at the edge of Hive space and issued orders that violated every principle of space warfare ever developed. Kira found herself leaning forward despite her growing unease. What kind of orders? She told her forces to fight like humans, Professor Korrigal said simply. Not like soldiers. Not like strategists, not like any rational military force. She told them to fight like the one species in the galaxy that had never learned to accept limitations. The implications were staggering. As the professor's words sank in, Kira began to understand why this information was classified. If humans could succeed where all advanced civilizations have failed, what did that say about the nature of human capabilities? The battle lasted 6 days, Professor Korrigal concluded. When it was over, the Hive Collective had been completely eliminated. The galaxy was saved, and every member of the Galactic Security Council agreed that humans must never be allowed to participate in another galactic conflict. But why? Jorik asked, his practical mind struggling with the apparent contradiction. If they saved the galaxy, why ban them? Professor Korrigal's ancient eyes seemed to bore into each of them. Because of what they did to win. Because of how they fought. Because what we witnessed in those 6 days revealed something about human nature that made every advanced civilization in the galaxy conclude that humans are the most dangerous species we have ever encountered. The holographic display faded, leaving them in the soft bioluminescent glow of the chamber walls. Kira felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Tomorrow, Professor Corrigal said quietly, I will tell you exactly what happened during those 6 days. I will explain why the sight of human victory was more terrifying than the prospect of hive defeat, and you will understand why the human exclusion protocol isn't just military policy. It's a survival mechanism for galactic civilization itself. As they left the chamber, none of the 4 students spoke. Each was lost in their own thoughts, trying to imagine what kind of victory could be so horrifying that it would result in the victors being banned from ever fighting again. Kira's analytical mind was working overtime, but for once, she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer to her questions. Some knowledge, she was beginning to realize, came with a price that might be too high to pay. But it was too late to turn back now. The forbidden question had been asked, and tomorrow, they would learn why some truths were meant to stay hidden. The Terran incident reveal of the next day arrived with an unusual stillness on Nexus Prime. Word had somehow spread through the Academy's student body that Professor Corrigal would be revealing classified information about humans, and the amphitheater was packed beyond capacity. Students from every corner of the galaxy have found excuses to attend, their curiosity overriding their usual academic schedules. Kira arrived early, her forearms carrying additional recording equipment despite knowing that such sessions were usually protected against documentation. She found her usual spot with Jorik, Lyra, and several other students who had become invested in uncovering the truth about humanity's military exclusion. Professor Corrigal entered precisely on time, but today he was accompanied by another figure that caused a ripple of excitement through the assembled students. Commander Thex Moontail, a decorated Saurian military officer whose reptilian features bore the scars of countless battles, followed the professor to the center of the amphitheater. Students, Professor Corrigal began, his crystalline voice carrying easily through the vast space. Today's lesson requires a first-hand account. Commander Moontail was present during the Terran incident as a junior fleet coordinator with the Saurian Navy. What you are about to hear is his direct testimony, classified for 2 centuries, and authorized for disclosure only by unanimous vote of the current Security Council. Commander Moontail stepped forward, his yellow eyes scanning the crowd of eager young faces. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had witnessed history's darkest moments. I was 23 years old when the Hive Collective awakened, he began. Young, eager, convinced that our superior technology and advanced tactics would make quick work of any threat. I had graduated from the Saurian Naval Academy with highest honors, and was assigned to the flagship of Admiral Corix, one of our finest military minds. The holographic display activated, showing the massive geometric forms of hive ships emerging from what appeared to be empty space. The first hive emergence occurred in the Kepler Remnant, a dead system that had been surveyed hundreds of times over the millennia. One day, it was empty space and stellar debris. The next day, it contained 17 massive hive constructs, each one the size of a moon, and they were moving toward inhabited systems at incredible speed. Kira watched the tactical displays with growing horror. The hive ships were unlike anything in her xenobiology databases, geometric perfection that somehow seemed alive, surfaces that shifted and flowed like liquid metal while maintaining rigid structural integrity. Admiral Corix assembled a response fleet of 400 ships from 7 different species. Commander Moontail continued. We had energy weapons that could crack planets, kinetic accelerators that could punch through stellar cores, and exotic matter projectors that manipulated spacetime itself. We were confident in our technological superiority. The display showed the first engagement, hundreds of sleek alien warships, arranged in perfect formation, facing the angular menace of the hive constructs. The battle lasted 47 minutes. Commander Moontail said grimly, we lost 60% of our forces and didn't inflict any meaningful damage. The hive ships absorbed our energy weapons and used the power to create more units. They analyzed our kinetic weapons and developed armor that turned our own projectiles against us. When we used exotic matter weapons, they somehow learned to manipulate spacetime better than we could ourselves. Jorik's practical engineering mind was reeling. How is that even possible? Adaptation takes time. Testing, iteration, not for the hive, Professor Corrigal interjected. They operated on principles we still don't fully understand. Every attack they absorbed made them stronger. Every tactic they witnessed was immediately countered and improved upon. They were, quite literally, a perfect military opponent. Commander Moontail nodded gravely. Over the next 18 months, we threw everything we had at them. The combined fleet of the Rigel Alliance, the crystalline hierarchy's reality-warping dreadnoughts, The Void Walkers phasing technology. The outcome was always the same: crushing defeat and hive adaptation. The holographic display now showed a galactic map with expanding red zones, indicating hive-controlled space. The advance was relentless, consuming entire sectors. By the end of the 18th month, we had lost 17 core worlds and over 60 colony systems. The hive was approaching Sol Sector, where Earth was located, and the Galactic Security Council was preparing evacuation protocols for the remaining inhabited worlds. Lyra's wings were trembling with emotional resonance as she sensed the despair and terror that must have pervaded galactic civilization during that time. That's when Admiral Sarah Chen made contact with the Security Council. Commander Moontail continued, "I was present for the transmission, serving as a communications liaison. I will never forget that conversation." The display shifted to show a human woman in her 40s, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to hold depths that were both brilliant and unsettling. Her uniform was simple compared to the elaborate regalia of other species, military leaders, but there was something about her presence that commanded attention. "Admiral Chen," the recording began, "the Council appreciates Earth's offer of assistance. But we must be frank. Human technology isn't sufficient to damage hive constructs. Your entire military capacity would be eliminated within hours of engagement." The human admiral's response was delivered in a calm, measured tone that somehow made it more disturbing. "Council members, with respect, you've been fighting the hive using the same fundamental approach for 18 months. You failed because you're trying to out-evolve an entity that exists specifically to evolve beyond anything you can conceive. We propose a different solution. What could humans possibly do that our combined civilizations cannot?" came the reply from the Council. Admiral Chen's slight smile was visible even across the centuries of recorded transmission. "We propose to fight them the way humans have always fought superior enemies. We're going to make them crazy." Commander Moontail paused the recording. At the time, none of us understood what she meant. The Council, desperate for any option, granted the humans permission to engage the hive at the edge of the Sol system. The display now showed the human fleet assembling near Neptune. Compared to the sleek vessels of other species, the human ships looked crude and improvised, but they moved with a kind of organic unpredictability that was unsettling to watch. The hive had learned to predict and counter every form of military organization they had encountered. Commander Moontail explained. Hierarchical command structures, tactical formations, strategic deployments, they had adapted to all of it. So Admiral Chen did something that no other species would even consider. What did she do? Kira asked, though she was beginning to dread the answer. She disbanded the command structure entirely. Professor Corrigal answered. She gave every human ship captain complete autonomy and told them to fight like humans. No coordination, no strategic planning, no tactical doctrine, just pure, undirected human creativity applied to military action. The holographic battle display that followed was unlike anything the students had ever seen. Human ships moved in seemingly random patterns, attacking from impossible angles, using weapons in ways they were never designed to be used, and employing tactics that violated every principle of space warfare. The hive couldn't adapt, Commander Moontail continued, because there was nothing consistent to adapt to. One human ship would ram a hive construct while playing classical Earth music at maximum volume. Another would fire all its weapons at random intervals while spinning in place. A third would begin broadcasting human poetry directly into hive communication frequencies. Lyra gasped as she realized the implications. They were introducing chaos into a system designed for perfect order. Exactly, Professor Corrigal confirmed, but it was more than that. The humans had weaponized their own irrationality. They were doing things so fundamentally illogical that the hive's adaptive systems couldn't process them. The battle continued on the display, and the students watched in growing amazement as the seemingly chaotic human tactics began to show results. Hive constructs, for the first time in the war, began showing signs of damage and confusion, but the real breakthrough came on the fourth day. Commander Moontail said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Admiral Chen ordered her forces to begin what she called psychological warfare against the hive. "How do you conduct psychological warfare against machines?" Jorik asked. "By making them experience emotions they were never designed to process," Professor Corrigal replied. The humans had realized that the hive's perfect adaptation was actually a weakness. Their systems were designed to analyze and counter logical threats, but they had no defense against pure, intentional madness. The display showed human ships beginning to broadcast streams of human art, music, literature, and philosophy directly into hive consciousness. They transmitted everything from love songs to abstract mathematics, from religious texts to comedic performances. The effect was devastating. Commander Moontail continued. The hive constructs began exhibiting behavior that could only be described as machine insanity. They started attacking each other, building structures that served no purpose, and creating art. Art, Kira echoed, her analytical mind struggling to process this information. Abstract sculptures made from destroyed ships. Complex geometric patterns that spelled out human poetry in languages the hive had never encountered. They were experiencing creativity, and it was destroying them from the inside. The final phase of the battle showed human ships working together, in perfect coordination for the first time. But their coordination was somehow more terrifying than their earlier chaos. They moved like a single organism with thousands of minds, anticipating each other's actions and supporting complex strategies that seemed to emerge spontaneously. On the sixth day, Admiral Chen broadcast a single message to the remaining hive constructs, Commander Moontail said. She told them a human joke. The room was completely silent now. Even the Academy's environmental systems seemed to have quieted in anticipation. The joke wasn't particularly funny by human standards, Professor Korrigal explained, but it contained a logical paradox wrapped in emotional context that required understanding of irony, cultural reference, and self-deprecating humor simultaneously. The hive's attempts to analyze and adapt to the joke created a cascading logic failure that spread through their entire collective consciousness. Within 6 hours, every remaining hive construct had shut down, Commander Moontail concluded. The threat that had defied our combined civilizations for 18 months was defeated by a species that had been spacefaring for less than a century. The holographic display faded, leaving the students in stunned silence. Kira's forearms were trembling as she processed the implications of what she had just learned. But that should have made humans the heroes of the galaxy, she finally managed to say. Why were they banned? Commander Moontail and Professor Korrigal exchanged a look that carried the weight of centuries. Because Professor Korrigal said slowly, what we witnessed wasn't just military victory. It was a demonstration that humans possess a form of intelligence, so alien to the rest of us that it borders on incomprehensible. They didn't just defeat the hive. They drove it insane. They weaponized creativity, chaos, and humor against a perfect logical system and won. The implications were terrifying, Commander Moontail added. If humans could do that to the hive, what could they do to us? What happens when a species that can weaponize irrationality decides that another species is a threat? The questions hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Kira realized that she was finally beginning to understand the true reason for the human exclusion protocol. Tomorrow, Professor Korrigal announced, we will discuss the aftermath of the Terran incident. You will learn what the humans did after their victory, how the galaxy responded, and why the human exclusion protocol may be the only thing standing between galactic civilization and total chaos. As the students filed out of the amphitheater, none of them spoke. They had wanted to understand why humans were banned from galactic warfare, and now they were beginning to realize that some questions led to answers that changed everything you thought you knew about the universe. Kira walked slowly through the crystalline corridors, her mind racing with possibilities and implications. Humans had saved the galaxy by being fundamentally different from every other intelligent species. But difference, she was learning, could be the most terrifying thing in the universe. The price of Victor I's final day of Professor Korrigal's revelation dawned with an unusual tension pervading Nexus Prime Military Academy. Word had spread throughout the galactic communication networks that classified information about humanity was being disclosed, and representatives from several governments had arrived to monitor the proceedings. The amphitheater was now filled, not just with students, but with military attaches, diplomatic observers, and intelligence operatives from across the galaxy. Kira arrived to find security checkpoints at every entrance, and dampening fields that would prevent any recording or transmission of the session's contents. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and underlying anxiety. Professor Korrigal entered with his usual dignified bearing, but today he was accompanied by a figure that caused a collective intake of breath from the assembled crowd. Fleet Admiral Nexus Brightstone of the Galactic Security Council, her elderly Altarian features bearing the weight of supreme military command, took position beside the professor. Citizens of the galaxy, Admiral Brightstone began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed across star systems. What you are about to learn has been classified at the highest levels for 2 centuries. The decision to reveal this information has not been made lightly, and it comes with grave implications for our future security. Professor Korrigal activated the holographic display, showing the aftermath of the hive destruction. Where once there had been geometric perfection, now only scattered debris drifted through space. Some pieces still exhibiting the strange artistic patterns the hive had created. During their madness, the immediate aftermath of human victory, Professor Corrigal began, was celebration throughout the galaxy. Entire worlds declared holidays. Species that had been enemies for millennia joined in commemoration ceremonies, and humanity was hailed as the saviors of galactic civilization. The display showed images of massive celebrations on hundreds of worlds, with humans being welcomed as heroes wherever they traveled. Admiral Chen and her forces were invited to every major world, given the highest honors each species could bestow, and offered anything they desired as reward for their service. Admiral Brightstone continued. The initial response from humanity seemed entirely appropriate. They expressed gratitude for the recognition, requested modest territorial concessions for Earth's growing population, and appeared to be integrating normally into galactic society. Kira noticed something in the Admiral's tone that suggested this integration hadn't remained normal. The first signs of concern arose 6 months after the victory, Professor Corrigal explained. Human colonies began reporting technological advances that shouldn't have been possible. Their ships were incorporating design elements that resembled hive technology, but modified in ways that our best scientists couldn't understand. The holographic display now showed human vessels that looked distinctly different from their crude pre-war designs. These ships seemed to flow through space with organic grace, while maintaining the unpredictable movement patterns that had made them so effective against the hive. We sent delegations to investigate, Admiral Brightstone said. What we found was disturbing. The humans hadn't just defeated the hive, they had studied it, analyzed it, and were incorporating its adaptive principles into their own technology. But they were doing it in ways that defied our understanding of both engineering and logic. Jorik leaned forward, his engineering background making him particularly interested in this development. What kind of modifications were they making? They were creating hybrid technologies, Professor Corrigal replied. Ships that could literally evolve their own weapon systems during combat, defensive systems that learn from each attack, and developed countermeasures in real-time communication, NETWORKS that exhibited emergent intelligence properties. But that wasn't the most disturbing discovery, Admiral Brightstone added grimly. We learned that the humans hadn't just absorbed hive technology, they had absorbed hive prisoners. A collective gasp echoed through the amphitheater. The concept of taking prisoners from a machine collective was unprecedented and deeply unsettling. How was that even possible? Lyra asked, her wings trembling with emotional resonance from the room's tension. We never fully understood how they did it, Professor Corrigal admitted. But somehow, Admiral Chen's forces had managed to capture and isolate individual hive units before the collective consciousness collapsed. They were keeping these units in a state of controlled consciousness, studying their adaptive mechanisms and learning to replicate them. The implications were staggering. The holographic display showed human research facilities were captured. Hive technology was being systematically analyzed and improved upon. The galactic intelligence community began monitoring human activities more closely. Admiral Brightstone continued. What we discovered was a species engaged in the most rapid military advancement in recorded history. Within 18 months of their victory, human military capabilities had evolved beyond anything we could track or predict. They were creating weapon systems that adapted faster than the original hive technology. Professor Corrigal explained. Ships that could modify themselves not just to counter specific threats, but to anticipate threats that hadn't even been conceived yet. Kira's analytical mind was working overtime to process the implications. They were becoming a hybrid species, part human creativity, part hive adaptation. Exactly, Admiral Brightstone confirmed. And that's when we realized the true scope of the threat humanity represented. The hive had been dangerous because it could adapt to anything we threw at it. But humans were becoming something far more dangerous, a species that could adapt to anything while maintaining the creative chaos that had allowed them to defeat perfect logic in the first place. The holographic display shifted to show classified intelligence reports from the period. Human colonies were expanding at unprecedented rates. Their ships were appearing in systems far from their declared territories, and their diplomatic communications had taken on characteristics that disturbed even experienced enough psychologists. The final straw came exactly 2 years after the hive victory, Professor Corrigal said. Admiral Chen requested a meeting with the Galactic Security Council. She wanted to discuss humanity's role in maintaining galactic stability. The display showed Admiral Chen, but she looked different now. Her eyes held depths that seemed almost alien, and there was something about her posture and movement that suggested she had changed in fundamental ways. During that meeting, Admiral Brightstone recalled, Admiral Chen made a presentation that convinced every member of the Security Council that humanity had evolved beyond our ability to coexist with them safely. What did she present? Kira asked, though she was beginning to dread the answer. A complete strategic analysis of every major species in the galaxy, Professor Korrigal replied. She demonstrated detailed knowledge of our military capabilities, our psychological weaknesses, our economic dependencies, and our social vulnerabilities. But more than that, she presented solutions. Solutions to what? Jorik asked. To the problem of galactic inefficiency, Admiral Brightstone said grimly. Admiral Chen had concluded that the galaxy's political and military structures were inadequate for preventing future existential threats. She proposed a comprehensive reorganization of galactic civilization under human guidance. The room fell into stunned silence as the implications sank in. The humans had studied their allies as thoroughly as they had studied their enemies. She presented detailed plans for optimizing the resource allocation of every major species. Professor Korrigal continued. She showed how human-directed coordination could increase military effectiveness by orders of magnitude, eliminate economic waste, and create a unified galactic defense network that could prevent any future threats. On the surface, it was logical and beneficial, Admiral Brightstone admitted, but the psychological profiles she had developed of each species revealed an understanding of our fundamental nature that was deeply disturbing. She knew exactly how to manipulate, control, and optimize every species in the galaxy. Lyra's empathic abilities were picking up the emotional resonance of the room, and she could feel the fear that still lingered in these ancient memories. She wasn't offering partnership, she was offering management. Precisely, Professor Korrigal confirmed. Admiral Chen and her team had absorbed not just Hive technology, but Hive methodology. They were thinking in terms of optimization, efficiency, and systematic improvement of all galactic civilization. The creative chaos that had made them unique was becoming organized and directed. But the most terrifying aspect of her presentation, Admiral Brightstone added, was that she was probably right. Her analysis was flawless. Her solutions were elegant, and implementing her recommendations would likely have created the most stable and secure galactic civilization in history. So why didn't the Council accept her proposal? Kira asked. Because we realized that accepting would mean the end of free will for every non-human species in the galaxy. Professor Korrigal replied. The humans had evolved into something that could optimize everyone else out of meaningful existence. The holographic display now showed the Security Council's emergency session. Following Admiral Chen's presentation, the faces of representatives from dozens of species reflected a mixture of awe, terror, and grim determination. The vote was unanimous. Admiral Brightstone said quietly, every species, regardless of their previous conflicts or alliances, agreed that humanity represented an existential threat to the fundamental nature of galactic civilization. But how could they enforce such a decision against a species that had just demonstrated superior capabilities? Jorik asked with his typical practical directness. We couldn't, Professor Korrigal admitted. At least, not through conventional means. Admiral Chen's response to the Council's rejection of her proposal was illuminating. The display showed Admiral Chen receiving the Council's decision with what appeared to be mild disappointment rather than anger or surprise. She simply said, "We understand your position and will respect your decision," Admiral Brightstone recalled. Then she added something that haunts me to this day. "We hope you won't need our help again, but we'll be ready when you do." The human forces withdrew from all galactic territories within 6 months, Professor Korrigal continued. They handed over all captured Hive technology, dismantled their hybrid research facilities, and returned to Earth and their original colonies. But intelligence reports suggested they had retained copies of everything they had learned. Kira's forearms were trembling as she processed the implications. They chose to accept the exile rather than fight for their rights, which made them even more terrifying, Admiral Brightstone explained. A species that could voluntarily restrain itself despite possessing overwhelming superiority demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that was beyond our ability to predict or counter. The holographic display shifted to show Earth and its colonies over the following decades. Human ships occasionally appeared at the edges of galactic space, but they maintained their distance and avoided all contact with other species. For 50 years, we monitored them carefully, Professor Korrigal said. Their technological development continued at an accelerated pace, but they seemed content to focus on their own expansion into previously uninhabited systems. We began to hope that the crisis had passed, but then came the first signs that our hopes were misplaced, Admiral Brightstone added grimly. Deep space monitoring stations began detecting anomalous energy signatures from the direction of human space, signatures that resembled Hive technology, but evolved far beyond anything we had seen before. The display showed energy readings that defied conventional physics, emanating from human colonies and patterns that suggested massive construction projects of unknown purpose. We sent stealth reconnaissance missions, Professor Corrigal continued. What they found was a human civilization that had transformed itself in ways we couldn't comprehend. Their cities existed partially outside normal spacetime. Their ships moved through dimensions we couldn't access, and their communication networks exhibited properties that suggested they had achieved some form of collective consciousness while maintaining individual identity. They had solved the fundamental problem that had destroyed the hive. Admiral Brightstone explained. They had achieved perfect adaptation and coordination without sacrificing creativity or free will. They had become something unprecedented in galactic history. Lyra's wings were now glowing with emotional resonance as she sensed the profound implications of this revelation. They had evolved into what the hive was trying to become, but maintained their humanity in the process. Exactly, Professor Corrigal confirmed. And that's when we realized that the human exclusion protocol wasn't protecting us from human aggression. It was protecting us from human benevolence. The statement hung in the air like a physical presence. Kira felt her worldview shifting as she grappled with this counterintuitive concept. If humanity had wanted to conquer the galaxy, they could have done so at any point after their victory. Over the hive, Admiral Brightstone explained, their voluntary acceptance of exile wasn't weakness. It was the ultimate demonstration of strength. They were protecting us from ourselves by removing the temptation to rely on their superior capabilities. But the story doesn't end there, Professor Corrigal said, his crystalline features darkening with concern. Recent developments have forced us to reconsider the human exclusion protocol. The holographic display shifted to show current intelligence reports marked with the highest security classifications. 6 months ago, our deep space monitoring network detected energy signatures that match hive technology, Admiral Brightstone announced. Not human-evolved hive technology, but the original hive collective consciousness. Something is stirring in the dead zones beyond the galactic rim. A collective gasp echoed through the amphitheater as the implications became clear. The hive wasn't completely destroyed, Professor Corrigal explained. Somehow, some fragment of their collective consciousness survived and has been slowly rebuilding itself for 2 centuries. Our analysts estimate that within 5 to 10 years, they will have sufficient resources to launch another invasion, and this time, they will have adapted to human tactics. Admiral Brightstone added grimly, they've had 200 years to analyze their defeat and develop countermeasures to human irrationality and creativity. Kira's analytical mind was racing through the tactical implications, which means conventional galactic forces will be even less effective than they were during the original invasion. Precisely. Professor Corrigal confirmed, the Galactic Security Council is facing an impossible choice. We can maintain the human exclusion protocol and face certain defeat against an evolved hive collective, or we can request human assistance and risk the transformation of galactic civilization under human guidance. What's the current status of discussions with humanity? Jorik asked. Admiral Brightstone's expression suggested the answer was complicated. We haven't made contact yet. The protocol explicitly forbids any communication with human forces, except in cases of galaxy-threatening emergencies. The Council is still debating whether the returning hive constitutes such an emergency. But there's another factor complicating the decision, Professor Corrigal added. Intelligence suggests that humanity is already aware of the hive's return. Human ships have been detected moving toward the dead zones, and their energy signatures indicate they're preparing for large-scale military operations. The implications were staggering. The humans weren't waiting for galactic permission or assistance. They were preparing to face the hive threat independently. If humanity defeats the hive again without galactic involvement, Admiral Brightstone said quietly, they will have demonstrated once and for all that they are the dominant species in the galaxy. The political implications of that reality would be even more challenging than their direct intervention. Lyra's empathic abilities were picking up waves of complex emotions from throughout the amphitheater: fear, admiration, confusion, and a growing sense that the galaxy was approaching a crossroads that would define its future. So we face 3 possible futures, Professor Corrigal summarized. Defeat by an evolved hive collective, voluntary subjugation to human guidance, or acceptance that humanity has surpassed the rest of galactic civilization so completely that we are no longer relevant to our own defense. None of these options preserve the current galactic order, Admiral Brightstone admitted. The human exclusion protocol was designed to protect galactic independence, but it may have simply delayed our eventual dependence on human capabilities. Kira stood slowly, her forearms steady despite the magnitude of what she had learned. Admiral, Professor, with respect, I think you're missing a 4th option. The attention of the entire amphitheater focused on her. and she felt the weight of hundreds of expectant gazes. Partnership, she said simply. Not subjugation, not dependence, but genuine collaboration between human capabilities and galactic diversity. Humanity chose exile to protect our independence. But what if we chose cooperation to protect everyone's future? Admiral Brightstone, consider this for a long moment. The risks of such an approach are enormous. Once we acknowledge human superiority, there's no guarantee that the relationship will remain equal. But the alternative is to let pride determine our extinction. Kira replied, humanity saved us once by being different from us. Maybe they can save us again by working with us. Professor Corrigal's crystalline features seemed to brighten slightly. There is historical precedent for your suggestion. Admiral Chen's original proposal wasn't for human domination. It was for human guidance toward mutual optimization. Perhaps the intervening centuries have allowed both sides to evolve toward a more balanced relationship. The decision ultimately rests with the full Galactic Security Council, Admiral Brightstone said. But your perspective will be included in our deliberations. The Human Exclusion Protocol was created by one generation's fear of human capabilities. Perhaps it's time for a new generation to consider human potential instead. As the session concluded and the students began filing out of the amphitheater, Kira remained seated, overwhelmed by the scope of what she had learned. The forbidden question she had asked 3 days ago had led to revelations that challenged everything she thought she knew about galactic civilization, human nature, and the price of survival. Jorik, Lyra, and her other friends gathered around her, each processing the information in their own way. Do you really think cooperation is possible? Lyra asked, her wings shimmering with uncertainty. I think it's the only option that preserves everyone's dignity, Kira replied. Humanity chose exile to protect our independence. Maybe it's time for us to choose cooperation to protect their humanity. As they walked through the crystalline corridors of Nexus Prime, Kira couldn't shake the feeling that their generation would be the one to determine the galaxy's future relationship with humanity. The Human Exclusion Protocol had been created to contain a threat, but perhaps it was time to recognize that the greatest threat to galactic civilization wasn't human superiority. It was the refusal to acknowledge that superiority and work with it constructively. The forbidden question had been answered, but it had led to an even more challenging question. Could a galaxy learn to accept help from a species that had evolved beyond the need for help themselves? Only time would tell, but Kira was determined to be part of finding that answer. The truth about humanity had been revealed, and now it was time to decide what to do with that truth. The galaxy stood at a crossroads, and the choices made in the coming years would determine whether the Human Exclusion Protocol would be remembered as a necessary protection or a tragic mistake that nearly cost civilization its greatest ally. As the 3 sons of Nexus Prime sat beyond the Academy's crystalline spires, Kira realized that her forbidden question had done more than satisfy her curiosity. It had opened the door to a future that none of them could fully imagine, but all of them would help create.